Most of us learn about nettles through pain. A bare ankle catches a leaf at the edge of a path, and within seconds the skin begins to burn. The lesson seems obvious: leave this plant alone. But people did the opposite. They cut nettles, carried them home, and stripped their stems. They cooked the young leaves. They made dyes, animal feed, and traditional medicines. Most surprising of all, they spun the plant into thread fine enough to weave cloth. One surviving piece is about 2,800 years old. It was found in Denmark, wrapped around cremated human remains inside a bronze urn. For decades, experts thought the fabric was linen. A new investigation found something far less expected. It was nettle, and the plant may have grown hundreds of kilometers from the place where the cloth was buried. Why would anyone put so much work into a plant that fights back? The answer begins inside a hollow hair, finer than anything we can see with the naked eye. The common stinging nettle is called Urtica dioica. Urtica comes from a Latin word associated with burning, while dioica refers to the species usually having male and female flowers on separate plants. It is a perennial. Beneath the soil, spreading rhizomes allow a patch to return and expand year after year. Above ground, its leaves grow in opposite pairs. Their toothed edges are easy to recognize, but the important structures are much smaller. The leaves and stems carry tiny hollow hairs called trichomes. The tip of each stinging hair is brittle. When skin brushes against it, the tip snaps and leaves a sharp point. Pressure on the base drives irritating chemicals through that point and into the skin. The result can be a red, itching patch and a burning sensation that outlasts the contact itself. This is a defense against hungry animals. For a large grazing mammal, a mouthful of nettles is an unpleasant mistake. The protection is not perfect, though. Several insects live and feed on the plant, including the caterpillars of peacock and small tortoiseshell butterflies in Britain. The sting makes the nettle seem hostile. It also tells us something about the people who used it. They had to know which part of the plant they wanted, when to harvest it, and how to make it safe enough to handle. In the 1860s, excavators opened a burial mound at Lucyhodge on the Danish island of Funen. Inside was a bronze urn holding cremated human remains. A piece of woven cloth had been wrapped around them. The textile was finely made. It had about 16 threads in each centimetre, running in both directions, and yarn only a fraction of a millimetre thick. Early examination identified the fibre as flax. That was a reasonable answer. Flax was a familiar textile plant in prehistoric Europe, and ancient plant fibres can be difficult to distinguish after thousands of years underground. In 2012, a research team returned to the cloth with different methods. Microscopic features and mineral crystals pointed to nettle. The researchers then measured strontium isotopes trapped in the fibres. Strontium enters plants from the geology beneath the soil, leaving a chemical pattern that can help narrow down where a plant grew. The pattern did not match Denmark. The closest fit lay much farther south, probably around the border region of modern Austria and Slovenia. The nettles, the prepared fibre, or the finished cloth had moved across a considerable distance before reaching the burial. That does not prove that nettle clothing was common in Bronze Age Europe. One precious fragment cannot tell us what most people wore. What it does prove is more interesting than the popular claim. Craftspeople could take a wild plant, process its stubborn stems, spin fine yarn, and produce balanced woven fabric. Someone valued that fabric enough for it to end its journey inside a burial mound. Nettle fibre does not come from the leaf. It lies in the long stem, in bundles beneath the outer surface. These are bast fibres, the same broad category found in flax and hemp. Reaching them takes work. The stems must be harvested, and the useful fibres separated from the woody core and the gummy material holding everything together. One method is retting, in which moisture and microbes help loosen the bonds. The dried stems can then be broken, scraped and combed. Repeated handling removes coarse fragments and aligns the fibres for spinning. The difference between a rough cord and fine cloth depends on skill at every stage. Harvest too early and the yield may be poor. Ret too little and the fibres remain difficult to free. Ret too long and they weaken. Then comes the slow work of cleaning, sorting, joining and twisting. This helps explain why archaeological textile evidence is scarce. Plant fibre decays easily. Identification is difficult, and old labels can survive in museum records long after better methods become available. The Lucy Hodge cloth had been known for roughly a century and a half before researchers established what it was made from. Nettle probably filled a useful gap. It did not need a prepared field in the way a cultivated crop did. It grew around disturbed, fertile ground and near human settlement. A community could gather it from places already shaped by animals, waste and daily life. The raw material was wild, but the finished cloth was anything but effortless. Fibre comes from mature stems. Food comes from the plant at a different moment, when the young shoots and leaves are still tender. Heat disables the stinging structures. Once cooked, nettles can be treated as a green vegetable and have long appeared in soups, puddings, teas and regional recipes. Kew records their use in Britain for beer, animal fodder and cheese making, as well as food. This was never as simple as eating whatever grew beside a ditch. Gathering required recognition and timing. Older leaves become tougher, and any wild harvest carries risks from contamination, mistaken identity and unsuitable growing sites. Historical use shows knowledge, not desperation alone. People had learned how one plant could provide a spring food and later in the year, a stem full of fibre. That combination made the nettle unusually flexible. A field of flax was a planned crop. A sheep was a valuable animal. Nettles appeared on their own, close to homes and paths, protected from many grazers by the very sting that made them inconvenient to people. Nettles also entered medicine, where the story becomes harder to tell cleanly. Leaves, roots and stings have all been used in traditional preparations. One of the more startling practices involved deliberately striking or rubbing painful joints with fresh nettles. The treatment even has a name, urtication. Historical records of such remedies show what people believed and tried. They do not tell us by themselves whether a treatment worked. Modern researchers have identified many compounds in nettle extracts and studied possible effects in cells, animals and people. Some trials have examined conditions such as enlarged prostate symptoms or blood sugar control. The evidence varies according to the preparation, plant part and condition. Results from a laboratory extract cannot be transferred automatically to a cup of tea, and a traditional recipe cannot be treated as a clinical dose. There are also useful negative findings. A systematic review of antibacterial research found no strong evidence that nettle extracts contain molecules with clinically useful antimicrobial activity. Reviews of other claimed benefits have found limited or inconsistent results. So the honest version is neither that ancient herbalists knew nothing nor that every old remedy has now been proved. They observed the plant, experimented with it, and passed on practices. Modern science asks narrower questions and often produces narrower answers. For much of Europe, flax, wool and imported cotton pushed nettle fibre towards the margins. Nettle was awkward to process on an industrial scale, and a wild supply could not easily match uniform cultivated crops. Shortage changed the calculation. During the First World War, Germany and Austria used nettle as a textile fibre when access to cotton became difficult. Governments and manufacturers also investigated nettle cultivation and processing during both world wars. This episode is sometimes inflated into a claim that German armies wore uniforms made entirely from nettles. The historical evidence supports a more careful account. Nettle fibre was collected, tested and used as a substitute material, but it did not simply replace every conventional textile. The important point is the reason it returned. Industry did not rediscover nettles because the plant had changed. Supply chains had. A material dismissed as inefficient became interesting when familiar fibres were scarce. The same problem remained, turning variable stems into clean, consistent fibre at scale. Nettle could produce strong, fine material. Producing enough of it at the right quality and price was another matter. Nettle never became a second cotton. Today it occupies several smaller worlds at once. It remains a food gathered by foragers and grown by some specialist producers. Gardeners ferment it into liquid feed. Textile researchers continue to study fibre nettle as a possible raw material, often blending it with other fibres. Herbal products keep older medicinal traditions in public view, though their marketing can run ahead of the evidence. The living plant has another value that earlier textile histories rarely noticed. A nettle patch is habitat. In Britain, it supports many insects, including butterflies whose caterpillars depend on it. Cutting every patch because it looks untidy can remove part of a small food web. None of this makes nettle a miracle crop. It can spread aggressively, its fibre takes effort to process, and modern uses still have environmental and economic costs. Its value has always depended on place, labour and need. Calling nettle a weed tells us where we do not want it. It says almost nothing about the plant itself. To a gardener it may be a stubborn invader. To a caterpillar it is food. To a Bronze Age spinner it was a source of fine thread. To people facing shortages it was one more fibre that could be gathered when other supplies failed. The Lucy Hodge cloth brings those viewpoints together. The nettle still had its sting. Someone harvested it anyway. Other hands separated the fibres, spun them and set them on a loom. The finished fabric travelled, served a purpose we cannot fully recover, and was placed with human remains. Then its identity disappeared until a new set of tools found it again. The plant had not been useless while we overlooked it. We had simply forgotten how much work and knowledge stood between the sting and the thread. Before it was ours, it already had a story.